Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here as always. I'm not gonna lie, I've already filmed this intro but I accidentally deleted it. So we're going again. This is now Grace from the future, here to talk to you about poetry. If you've seen any of my videos before, then you may well know that I have been writing for pretty much as long as I can remember. I've always wanted to be a writer, but in recent years I've struggled with burnout and perfectionism and finding that joy in writing that I used to feel. I've written in many different forms throughout the years, but one that I always tend to gravitate to when I'm trying to express myself and my emotions is poetry. At the same time, I have mixed feelings about poetry, largely because it is just so subjective. All writing is subjective in that one person can read a book and love it and another person can read it and think it's garbage. But I feel like poems are that, but intensified. A lot of people hate poems as a whole, which as someone who enjoys poetry, at least sometimes, that makes me sad. But also as someone who struggles with perfectionism and a need to be liked, it's difficult for me to write poetry, especially if I think it's gonna go anywhere, because I know that not everyone is going to like it. Conversely, I think it might be a good idea for me right now, because my current goal isn't to get published, to become incredibly successful and share my work with the world. It is precisely the opposite. It's to retrain myself away from that thinking that that is the only purpose to writing, and remind myself that it can just bring me joy and fulfillment and be a way for me to process my emotions. So I think poetry might be a useful medium for me to work in right now, because for me it is inherently a lot more personal and less performative. So I thought for this video it would be good, first of all, for me to get back into my poetry era by reading some poetry for the first time in a little while. So I took a big stack of poetry books out from the library. If you don't know, I work at a library currently, so I have a decent amount of time to scour the shelves for poetry books that I think sound interesting to me and to reserve them from other libraries. So we got a big haul, but there are three in particular that I'd like to read right now for some inspiration in this video. The first one being The Orange by Wendy Cope. I have never read anything by Wendy Cope before except for the poem The Orange, because it is everywhere, which is fair enough because it is a lovely poem. She has been a successful poet in the UK for many years now. From what I've heard, she's quite witty and blunt in the way that she writes, and I've had a little flick through and a lot of these poems are quite short. They seem quite different to the poetry that I tend to read, which is a little bit more meandering and, dare I say, pretentious. I think it will be interesting for me to read a different style than I usually go for, and Wendy Cope is just so well loved that I think it is time. The next one I have is A Recipe for Sorcery by Vanessa Kisuule. Honestly, I picked this one up because it had sorcery in the title, which was an immediate green flag for me. This has no blurb at all, so I very vaguely am getting the gist of what this is about from reading the first page. There is definitely a strong food theme in here, and food as metaphor for many other things. And the writing style, at least to begin with, seems a little bit snarky, which I quite enjoy. But other than that, I don't know much. I just have a feeling this will be interesting. And the last one I'd like to have a look at in this video is A God at the Door by Tishani Doshi. I don't know too much about this collection in particular, but I read Girls Are Coming Out of the Woods by the same poet and I really enjoyed that collection. I think that Tishani Doshi's writing is just very lush, and there were several poems in there that really emotionally connected to me, so I'm excited to give another one of their collections a try. The only thing that makes me a little bit sad is that I don't really annotate my books except for poetry books. I think that a lot of the time, because they need a little bit more thought to dissect and understand, and you often have to reread them and look really closely, it can be very useful to be able to annotate them. But of course, these are library books, so I can't do that. But maybe if I really love any of these, I can get my own copy and then annotate them afterwards. So the plan is to read a little bit of poetry, hopefully find a little bit of inspiration to work on a poem or two of my own, let myself experiment with form and express myself. I may give you some snippets here and there, but I will at the very least describe how I'm feeling, the context of what I'm working on, and how I feel about reading some poetry for the first time in a while. I'm quite excited to get back into my poetry girl era. Of course, this is Grace from the future, but it was a very rainy day when I started filming this video, so we will now head out into the rain and hunt down a cozy little coffee shop to get some reading and hopefully some writing done. Hello, I am back home now. It was very wet out there and it has smudged my eyeliner. It was pouring it down. But I went to a little coffee shop and I read all of The Orange by Wendy, and then I also started A God at the Door by Tishani Doshi. I thought I was gonna kind of jump around a little bit more, but The Orange was just really easy to get through. I enjoyed this. It's a very short little collection and the poems are quite short, so it's a really fast read, but I would at the same time like to reread this a few times, which I think is usually the right thing to do with poetry. Although I will say that this was a lot simpler in some ways than a lot of the poetry I have read in the past. It was quite refreshing, really, because most of the poetry I've read you really have to think and dive into the specific word choices to get your head around what the poet is trying to say, and sometimes it'll just go totally over your head, or at least mine. But this is reasonably easy to understand, but at the same time there are some really interesting moments in here. I think the thing that I personally enjoy about poetry is when you find something written down that you've never been able to put into words before, but you can understand that feeling or thought and they have just managed to express it perfectly. But one of my favourite lines in this one is from After the Lunch, which I think describes someone's feelings after a date in which they're trying not to feel like they might be in love. Each stanza in the poem begins with "on Waterloo Bridge," so this is where the couple are saying their goodbyes for the day, and then the poem ends with "the head does its best, but the heart is the boss. I admit it before I am halfway across." And that first half feels a little bit cliche, the whole head versus heart situation, but I really like the second line, the "I admit it before I'm halfway across," that begrudging self-acceptance. And I also, in a way, quite enjoy that Wendy isn't afraid to delve into a little bit of cliche. I think sometimes some of the poetry that I've read can try so hard not to be cliche that it ends up just feeling a little bit contrived. So this was quite refreshing for me. It's quite different from a lot of the poetry books that I normally read and felt a little bit less pretentious, maybe, in some ways. I definitely like to reread this one again at some point. And then I started A God at the Door, and I really like Tishani Doshi's writing. Now this is the kind of poetry that I definitely need to read several times before I really know at all what it's about. I think you get glimpses on a first read and there are things that will stick out to you, but you have to delve into these things before you can really grasp even your version of a connection, because obviously you're never going to fully know what the poet intended, and that's one of the beautiful things about poetry, is that it will mean something different to you than it did to the author. Death of the author, we love to see it. But I really enjoyed the first poem in here called Mandala, which begins with anyone who believes a leaf is just a leaf is missing the point, which I love that line. So I'm only a few poems into this one, but I'm enjoying it so far. I then tried to write a little bit and I did a tiny little bit of something. I'm really struggling with feeling like I don't have anything important enough to write about at the moment. And also with feeling like I'm being too self-referential. The only thing that I really could write about was writing itself, because a lot of my feelings these days come from my personal issues with writing. And I do feel like poetry of all mediums is the most self-referencing. There are a lot of poems about poems, and maybe because there's already so much written around that subject, I find it difficult to write without feeling like it's already been said, which in my current process shouldn't really matter because I'm just writing these for myself to get my own feelings onto the page. I think at the end of the day too, the medium that really calls to me is still stories. I would still love to write a novel one day, whether that will happen, who knows? But one thing that I've noticed, especially this year, is the books that I've really enjoyed so far this year have often been mixed format. For example, the Illumination of Ursula Flight is one of my favourite books I've read so far this year, and that is told somewhat in classic prose, but also in scripts, in letters, in lists, in tables, lots of different formats, and I found that so interesting. It really conveyed the main character's personality and made me laugh a lot, which I really enjoyed, and opened my eyes to the ways in which I could be writing more experimentally. I've also really enjoyed a lot of epistolary stories recently, like Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. I love being able to hear a character's voice that directly. I could definitely be interested in working on a book like that at some point, but for now, because of that leaning, I would like to work on my writing in a lot of different formats and just build up that groundwork again, that foundation of skill, hopefully, for me, so that if I do get to the point where I feel mentally ready to work on a novel again, then if I wanted to be experimental with my formatting, I could do that. And I think poetry is definitely a good thing to practice for that purpose. I'm gonna try and write a little more, and then I'm working tomorrow, but I'm around on Friday, so hopefully I can read a little bit more poetry in the meantime and get back to writing again on Friday. On another note, I found a new music artist earlier today just on Instagram. They had a really cool post with very, not cottagecore, kind of like a grimier cottagecore vibe. They're giving Bog Witch. They're called Rabbitology. Would highly recommend checking them out if you want kind of a fantasy, moss-covered coven vibe. Would highly recommend New Girl, Old Ghosts and Candleburn. But I have just been putting every song of theirs on repeat as I've been wandering around today. Anyway, I'm gonna go cook some food now. Chris will be home soon and I will update you when I've done either some more reading or some more writing, which will probably be on Friday, so see you there. It is a couple of days later now. I was at work yesterday, but I did find myself inspired at some point and ended up scribbling something down on a little scrap of paper. As you can imagine from the fact that I am just around books all day when I'm at work, I stumble across a lot of books that I want to read. I think I currently have 24 books out of the library, which is madness. There is no way that I can read even half of those before I have to take them back. When I worked at a bookshop, my restraint was not much better, but I had to make a lot more justification when I was buying a book than when I'm borrowing a book. And also, in a way, I know that it's doing good to issue more books from the library. It shows the people who fund the library that they're being used. Use your local library. But anyway, yesterday I found another book that I thought looked so intriguing and interesting. I'm sure that this is a feeling all readers have, that there is just not enough time to read all of the books that you know you would love if you could get to them, and it makes me sad sometimes. And I ended up scribbling down this little first stanza. To all the books I'll never read, my most heartfelt of apologies. I am a being far too finite to comprehend your intricacies. I'd quite like to turn it into a rubaiyat, that's what I'm thinking of. This is a chaining quatrain, so Each stanza is 4 lines, and the first 2 and the 4th line rhyme, but the 3rd line doesn't, but then you pick up that 3rd line's rhyming sound and move that down to the next stanza and make that the first 2 and the 4th line. So the first stanza is A, A, B, A, and the second stanza is B, B, C, B, etc. I do usually tend to write reasonably freeform if I write poetry, but I do find it fun to work with specific forms sometimes. It can just fuel your brain a little bit more, and sometimes when you just have no boundaries, I find that my mind just goes blank. There's too many options, and if I narrow that down a little bit, it can funnel my creativity, I think. So I'd kind of like to finish this in that form, but I also think it might be interesting to expand it into more of a creative essay. We'll see. I think this is what is fun about writing in different forms for me, is that I can mix and match between the two and shift back and forth. Something doesn't have to stay in the same format if it begins that way. As long as I have the idea, it's a step forward, it's a positive thing. I also started reading a little bit of A Recipe for Sorcery by Vanessa Kisuule, and I am really liking this so far. I think that her writing is really gorgeous. I've only read a few poems so far, so I don't want to speak too soon, but this theme is such a strong one, I think, of using food almost to cast spells, to make magic, to change you as a person. There are several poems in here that are written as a recipe for insert feeling here. There's a recipe for sustenance, a recipe for retaliation, a recipe for retreat, and they each begin with a "you will need these ingredients" list, but the ingredients will be something like thicker skin, 10 streetlit walks back home, someone's warmth against yours, and then the second part of the poem is the method. I'm just finding that really effective. So I'm gonna try and do a little bit more reading and maybe writing today. I definitely want to read some more of this because I'm finding it really inspiring so far, and maybe I could try writing one of those recipe style poems myself. That might be fun. I think I'm getting glimpses again of that feeling of excitement. I remember at university being shown all of these new writers, and there were so many interesting ideas that they all had that I never would have thought of myself, and that's one of the things that has always brought me just that sense of excitement and joy, is all of the possibilities and all of this wide open space that I've definitely been scared of in recent years. Seeing all of these blank pages as a whole rather than an opportunity, I think because I was feeling like writing was something I should be doing rather than something I could do. So I'm getting a glimpse of that feeling again, I think. I don't want to speak too soon and assume I've had like a big revelation when I think it's very much going to be baby steps for me, but I'm enjoying this experiment and branching out my horizons once again. Hello, welcome to the end of the video. I'm not gonna lie, it's been a bit of a disastrous day, from realizing that I'd accidentally deleted half of my footage for this video to accidentally leaving several of my memory cards from my camera behind at the cute little cafe we visited and having the lovely lady working there run out after us. It's been a bit of a mess. We're going on holiday tomorrow, and as much as I'm looking forward to it, that always makes me quite scrambled in my brain, and you can tell. But yes, I am trying not to let the stress of the situation get in the way of the fact that this little writing experiment has been a success. I have done some writing, not a huge amount, but that's not really the point right now. It's more that I have enjoyed writing the little poems and snippets of poems that I have worked on. Today I decided to go for giving that recipe format a try, and I wrote a little recipe for reflection. Some of the ingredients are a book you loved when you were 15, an old letter confirming a therapy appointment, and the pile of yarn half knitted in the cupboard. That's definitely been a theme of the poems I've wanted to work on. The one that I was working on Wednesday was about me wondering if I needed to understand myself better in order to write good poetry, because a lot of the time a poem can give you that kind of eureka moment of understanding and being able to comprehend something about yourself, and if I don't understand myself, how can I convey that for someone else? Which is interesting because when I was at uni I wrote a completely inverse poem that was wondering if you write better when you are mentally unstable. Let me see if I can find it. I actually really liked that poem. Here we go. I actually still really like this poem. I often look back on old work and I'm like, ooh, yikes. But I feel like this holds up. It's called How to Write. So let the old plants plume up from your spine, pruning shears now cast aside, a mind of overgrowth, leeching mistletoe, until your nose, your ears, your eyes are sprouting twisted, crease-warped vines. Do you remember what comes next? That's it. Pull out root and nerve, scatter thoughts left to preserve, and here's your winnings, a stack of papers, full to brimming, pressed and cured. That's just a little bit, I won't read you the whole thing. It's so strange to look back at your old self and know that you used to be better at something than you are now, that you've gone backwards, I guess. And that's why I'm trying my best to be gentle with myself and to see writing that I've done in the past and I still like personally. Obviously it's not for everyone, but there is work that I've done in the past that I still personally think is good. And I'm trying to see that as proof that I am capable of doing it, rather than be sad that I can't live up to it right now. Baby steps. The fact that I have enjoyed this, I have enjoyed writing the little bits that I have, and I've really enjoyed getting back into reading some poetry. I read a bit more of A Recipe for Sorcery and I'm really enjoying this. I think the writing is gorgeous so far. Would highly recommend if you are a poetry reader. I don't entirely know what my takeaway from this experiment is, other than I would like to do more experiments like this. I think it is helping just to remind me of the ways that I can branch out and the practice I can do to relearn this skill that I once had, but also relearn my mindset around it and enjoy it rather than putting a crazy amount of pressure on. I definitely want to foster a culture of enjoying things because they're enjoyable rather than because you're good at them. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you have any creative hobbies that you maybe enjoy but aren't incredible at, or if you have similar issues to me and find you often can only enjoy things if you're good at them. I'm also really appreciating this space because filming these videos is such a great impetus for me to try these experiments and push through these barriers that I've built up in my head and get out of my comfort zone that I've been hiding in. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it so much, as always. I hope you are being kind to yourself today and always, and I hope you have the loveliest week. I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.